Chapter 3. A Tale of Hunger Retold. Ravishment and Hunger in F. Douglass's Life and Writing. Frederick Douglass described slavery, more eloquently than anyone else has, as a cannibalistic institution. In images striking and poetically resonant, he depicted slavery in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, as a personified stern reality, glaring frightfully upon us, its robes already crimsoned with the blood of millions, and even now feasting itself greedily upon our own flesh. Slave traders he thought of as human flesh-mongers. In the context Douglass described, slave owners cultivated consumption, hunger, and starvation at all levels of social interaction. If it was not Aunt Katy, the cook on one plantation, who was literally starving Douglass, then it was a master punishing a hungry slave for stealing molasses by making him drink gallons of it until he sickened, and gorged on the sweetness. Such examples proliferate in all of Douglass's works, including Narrative, 1845, My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, 1881. To my knowledge, little scholarly analysis exists of the culture of consumption depicted in Douglass's narratives. This is striking, considering that in Douglass's narratives and in the slave narratives I discussed in previous chapters, such references abound, not to mention those slaves who were literally consumed and the catalog of flesh cooking, consumption rituals, and habitual flesh-taking that formed a part of the larger archive of consumption. Building on the findings of earlier chapters, I want to move beyond acknowledging and arguing for cannibalism as a social reality for the enslaved person to the particular ways that the male slave resisted and internally wrestled with this dominant hunger and appetite. In this chapter, I examine 3 different ways that Douglass wrestled with consumption at the hands of others and self, the 2 acts often occurring simultaneously. First, I examine how mental and emotional consumption coincided with coded instances of rape at the hands of an overseer. Sexual and spiritual consumption overlap, especially in Douglass's first 2 narratives, providing insight into how he understood sex, at least abusive sex, as one way white men attempted to consume him. Also in this first section, I introduce the topic of incest. The most formative sexual encounters that shape Douglass's life and structure his narratives have to do with the incestuous treatment of an aunt, his mother, and himself. This topic of incest takes on increased importance as Douglass attempts throughout his life to work through sexually laden kinship ties with white men. The second thing I consider is a condition of mother hunger that characterized much of Douglass's life. The fear of social consumption, the hunger for family, for civilized lineage, for safety, physical satiation, and for paternity showed up often in Douglass's writing as mother hunger. Even in his relationships with white authoritative figures and heads of state, this mother hunger emerged as erotic desire, affection, and the need for care and intimacy. Lastly, I apply the framework of male effeminacy developed in the previous 2 chapters to Douglass himself. Alongside his heroic male identity, Douglass described himself as playing the role of male concubine and male daughter to the plantation system and to certain white male authority figures. Douglass depicts this role mostly as negative, but I focus on how from a reproductive, procreative perspective, this role strikes a balance in his life. For out of a dangerous, potentially self-consumptive hunger, he gives birth to the central statutes and tenets of the U.S. Republic. This hunger and desire, combined with Douglass's intellect and stoic reserve, inform his vision and unique contributions of genius to American culture. For the most part, scholars of Douglass's written work have overlooked the proliferation of references to appetite, multiple layers of hunger, and consumption in his 3 narratives. David Van Leer, an exception to this trend, calls attention to a section from the narrative that highlights the horrors of cannibalism, dismemberment, and execution. In his cursory treatment of cannibalism in Douglass's narrative, Van Leer describes such occurrences as imaginative acts and as part of a fictionalizing moment in Douglass's text. Importantly, rather than treating Douglass's claims as real, Van Leer metaphorizes and fictionalizes the race leader's observations. Van Leer analyzes textual and literary conventions such as the Gothic and sentimental traditions informing Douglass's style and choice of images. The deeper presumption underlying Van Leer's observations and I believe fueling the inattention to this topic in Douglass's writing is the notion that cannibalism has nothing to do with enlightenment, with myths of American progress, and with nation-making in the 19th century. It is, to put it bluntly, inconceivable to most that cannibalism was an implicit aspect of slave culture and, more broadly, of American race/caste systems based in the sycophancy of slavery. Still, Douglas depicts the slave institution as cannibalistic, and he gives us also a telling glimpse into the manner in which he internally resisted and wrestled with the reality of his social consumption. Describing the slave condition as one of consumption and self-consumption, Douglas describes slavery in the narrative as a condition of starvation, causing us to eat our own flesh. In the life and times of Frederick Douglass, he describes himself as enmeshed in webs of soul-devouring thought that reinforce the fact that he is a slave. Douglass parallels the material reality of cannibalism with interlocking ideologies of cannibalism that allow the master to consume the slave in body as well as in spirit and thought. Douglass's observations affirm Carl O. Williams's understanding of slavery as a highly stylized, institutionalized form of cannibalism. Williams describes thraldom, slavery, as a degree of cannibalism, wherein the master is a human parasite who, by the right of might, has secured his fellow man in the bonds of thraldom in order to feed upon him for the satisfaction of his appetite. Further elaborating on the erotics of this libidinal hunger, Orlando Patterson notes that what the slave mainly fed was the master's sense of honor and his sexual appetite, for the economic role of the slave was quite marginal among most of the continental Germanic tribes. Germanic slavery, differing from U.S. chattel slavery, was less economically driven and more of a domestic variety, which served to highlight the interpersonal connections between master and slave. Though U.S. slavery was economically driven, this tie between the hunger and sexual appetite of the ruling class also applied to it. Perhaps even more so, as the exoticization of the African type and early racial codes heightened white titillation at the thought of black flesh. In the 19th century, allusions to the consumption of and flesh hunger for black males proliferated in American culture. However, black men such as Douglass often alluded to this culture through subtle references to manhood and black male bodies exotically exposed before whites. In an 1854 speech delivered by the racial liberator before an audience of educated white males, Douglass debated the subject of black humanity. An ethnologist by the name of Mr. Grant who was present at the meeting distributed scientific statistics and studies as proof against the humanity of the Negro. A master elocutionist, Douglass used the stark example of himself, his powerful rhetorical capabilities, his face, and his entire physical conformation to refute Grant's argument. Turning to the assembled audience, he demanded of them, "You judge between me and the gentleman, Mr. Grant. Am I a man?" This exchange and especially Douglass's closing reference to his manhood calls to mind a more notorious contestation over gender that occurred the following year, in 1851. According to Dana Gage's synopsis of the Ohio Women Rights Convention, Sojourner Truth towered, had a commanding air about her, and consistently drew attention to the problem and plight of black womanhood through her oft-repeated question, "Aren't I a woman?" Cognizant of the biblical arguments against black humanity, Truth used references to biblical women to authorize her voice and the fact that she could labor as much as any man to reset the premium of the burden and labor of black females. On a separate occasion, at a meeting Truth convened in Indiana in 1858, the female itinerant preacher found herself challenged outright as a man and not a woman. Before removing herself backstage to undergo a breast exam by white women present at this event, Truth masterfully exposed the undercurrent of sexualization, incest, and the desire for access to black female bodies that was fueling her accusers. She invited them to suck at her breasts, offered to reveal her bosom before all persons assembled, and compared the men present to white babies sucking at the breast of a plantation nursemaid. Importantly, Truth's references to suckling, tasting, and ingesting allude to the social consumption of the black female caregiver. Issues of sexual access, physical exposure, and rape also informed Douglass's presentation, but he deflected audience attention from the feminine exposure of his body, taking off his shirt to reveal his scars, by drawing their attention to the masculine display of his face, voice, and intellectual prowess. Navigating through undercurrents of exposure/concealment, secrecy/revelation, Douglass offers his visage and commanding posture as a standing accusation against the slaveholder fathers and their concealed sexual crimes. Douglass was well aware that whites, even abolitionist whites, took pleasure and gratification in seeing black bodies exposed. In My Bondage and My Freedom, he observes that John A. Collins, general agent of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, would often introduce him as a graduate from the peculiar institution. "With my diploma written on my back," he found himself consistently referred to as a brand new fact, property, chattel, and a thing by abolitionists. Collins and others would habitually caution Douglass against speaking with too much education in his voice. "Better have a little of the plantation manner of speech than not," they chided. "'Tis not best that you seem too learned." The irony of having to speak in this manner, from the so-called slave body, is that the most visceral truths pertaining to consumption and sexual maltreatment remained obscured. White men did not have to own up to their subtle phallic references and anxieties and their desires for a nurturing, consumable black male, phallic object. I will come back to this connection among black masculinity, nurturing, and white male appetite as it recurs in Douglas's relations with white men. The naked, unintelligible slave body served as fodder for the white imagination. It allowed whites to entertain the idea of the Negro as the lady of races, as passively subject to the more aggressive will and ways of the European. It also reinforced the idea of the slave as infantile. In relationship to abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, Douglas wrote that he stood something like that of a child to a parent, which harkened back to Douglas's infantile relationships to cruel parental plantation masters. I place Douglas alongside Truth as a way of illuminating how they each had to negotiate an idea of black humanity linked ideologically and historically to issues of gender variance, sexual, homosexual, abuse, white appetite, and incestuous kindred relationships to white masters and their plantation progeny. In contrast to Truth, Douglas and black men in general dealt with such issues through diversion. They drew attention away from their bodies and their sexuality. Am I a man? Aren't I a woman? Each question informed the other, and as questions rather than statements revealed a sense of gender instability both Douglas and Truth felt. We still do not know what to do with the reality of Truth's sexual molestation by one of her plantation mistresses or, more broadly, with the complex ways white women desired, hated, abused, and sexually lusted after black women on the plantation. In the case of Douglas, who masterfully manipulated the desires and expectations of the white men in his audience, questions of effeminacy, sexual abuse, and sexual transgression form a template. Not speaking about these topics, titillating and chastising his male listeners with his common knowledge, make possible Douglas's claims to heroic masculinity. Scholars of Douglas's life and work have tended to focus upon and emphasize the male aspects of Douglas's genealogy, his relationships to Garrison and Wendell Phillips, his relationships to Wald, Covey, and Sandy from the plantation, his depiction of his maternal legacy as the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II. We should never forget that Douglas, a master linguist, always spoke in code. He always spoke to both sides of a gender fluidity that lay at the root of his epistemology and rhetorical self-fashioning. Given this fact of Douglas's rhetoric, I want to move, momentarily, into the murky, unstable regions of the question "Am I a man?" Because I think that we have tended to presume too much about the fixity of Douglas's manhood. We have presumed too much, I feel, about Douglas's internal investment in being a man, especially when he consistently employed female modes of speaking about sexual violation, personal mythology, and genealogy in his writing. In addition to recording a masculine genealogy of experience, Douglas wrote to situate himself within a sublimated genealogy of female experience. As evidence of this female genealogy, I want to turn briefly to the notorious Aunt Hester scene first recounted in Douglas's narrative and referenced in his last two autobiographies. Deborah McDowell has written that Douglas's graphic depiction of his aunt's abuse puts him into a voyeuristic relation to the violence against slave women, which he watches, and thus enters into a symbolic complicity with the sexual crime he witnesses. Likewise, Van Leer has interpreted this scene as marking the impenetrable boundary of Douglas's manhood. He writes, "As a male he is shut out from a knowledge of this uniquely female experience." McDowell and Van Leer, each in different ways, presume a boundary of masculinity marked by female abuse, Van Leer suggesting even that Douglas was not sexually abused and was never subject to the struggles of sexual dominance that define his aunt's existence. While I do not want to dismiss valid points that do speak to Douglas's overt self-fashioning and performing of masculinity for his reader, I want to insert a third reality. And that is that Douglas narrates Hester's graphic abuse because he intimately understood it and because it was the only way that he could reference his own struggles over sex, against sexual consumption, and against the master's quest for sexual dominance over the male slave's body. The brutality and trauma of Douglas's narrative literally begins with the Hester scene. Up to that point, Douglas gives general information, a description of where he grew up and the details of his family life. A few pages into the narrative, the author assails us with the image of the aunt hanging from a meat hook in the kitchen. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope, and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist, put in for the purpose. He made her get upon the stool, and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. Her arms were stretched up at their full length, so that she stood upon the ends of her toes. Douglas alludes to the brutalizer's absence of pure morals and virtue. In his depictions of the master's cursing of Hester, frequently calling her a D.B.H., and his outrage that she would go to see her lover from another plantation, Ned Roberts, Douglas gives us just enough information to understand the master's sexual motivations. While Douglas probably could have, he does not take from his memories a literal instance of rape. Slaves, male and female, never depicted the graphic details of rape. They alluded to it often, but out of concern with decorum and preserving the sensibilities of their readers, they never provided graphic sexual details. By giving us a torture scenario laden with sexual tension, and the implicit understanding that Anthony has raped Hester in the past, Douglas brings us more immediately into the layered and complicated meanings of slave life. In this world, physical brutality is often informed by sexual violence and the dynamics of sexual domination. Also important is the undercurrent of incest. Captain Anthony, the slave master, is Douglas's father, which Douglas knows at the time he pens the narrative. It is possible that Anthony's father raped Hester's mother, resulting in a kinship tie between the captain and Hester. Her noble form and graceful proportions, unparalleled among the colored or white women of the neighborhood, allude to her mulatto racial status. Douglas does not give enough details for the reader to know her exact parentage. One thing that we know from slave history, though, is that incestuous behavior on many plantations was generational, a pattern of behavior that the son learned from the plantation father or overseer. Hester may have had a blood tie to Anthony, she may have been the daughter of his father, his uncle, or some other male relative. If Hester and Anthony did share a blood tie, then the prospect of Douglas, cowering in the closet, fearing that he too might undergo the same type of punishment, takes on added meaning. He is not just speaking a child's terrors. Rather, he is honing in on the ways that this dynamic of sex and brutality unveils a dynamic of incest. Literally and metaphorically, then, Hester embodies a female genealogy for Douglas, a genealogy characterized by the body so debilitated and abused that it cannot speak, by incestuous desire, by the ritual sport of abuse, by gender ambiguity, and, most importantly, by the spectacle of white male appetite and hunger. It is no coincidence that Hester's beating takes place in the kitchen and that Anthony, like the master who beat Henry Bibb's wife, seems as though he would rather paddle a female than eat when he was hungry. Hester is hung up on a meat hook. Her pooled blood and flesh particles commingle with sites of food preparation, with the whole enterprise of feeding and sustaining life on the plantation. Hester brings into focus the multiple meanings of plantation torture and the difficulty of interpreting the scars and pain that result. As I showed earlier, in the example with Douglas speaking about black humanity before an all-male audience, Douglas maintained a poignant awareness of the ways in which the naked, exposed body could work against him, diffusing his claims to representative manhood. The difficulty of speaking about the body, as I demonstrated earlier, shaped his early encounters with proprietary abolitionists. Early on in his public speaking career, Douglas refused abolitionists and the audience they generated access to his body. Touring throughout Europe with Garrison, before the publication of his first narrative, Douglas replaced his body with that of his cousin Henny. Douglas frequently employed his cousin Henny to act out the role of female victim as an ancillary to his anti-slavery speeches, while also displaying ostentatiously a variety of whips, chains, and other tools of slavery, so as to make manifest the violence of a system that was often described elsewhere in more euphemistic terms. Douglas does exactly what McDowell asserts: he uses the mother and the female body as the vehicle that ensures his speakerly authority. In this way, the mother/woman's silence precipitates the male/son's ability to speak. Henny shows, embodies, and demonstrates slavery, but it is Douglas who narrates and translates the body. He performs this same narration and translation on behalf of Hester. The effect of this gesture is that within the larger culture, Douglas comes to embody slavery, to take on the role of paradigmatic slave, a gesture that was part of linguistic convention and a general cultural tendency to privilege maleness. Douglas was not the only black male author from his time period to use black female sex and torture in this manner. Francis Foster notes that from William Wells Brown's character of Clotel to Alex Haley's Kizzy, our most frequent images of slave women are as victims of illicit sexual intercourse and as childless mothers. According to Foster, the reason black men gravitated to such depictions of black women during slavery and after is that the selling of children and the raping of women were actual events and the genre of the slave narrative defined women in terms of manners, morals, and motherhood. Anticipating McDowell's observations, Foster sees black men during slavery using female sex and abuse to foreground their manhood and natural paternal rights. Foster's observations show that Douglas's use of the black female was not an individual occurrence. Rather, it was symptomatic of a culture of 19th-century black masculinity and slave narrative rhetoric. McDowell writes of a latent grammar operating beneath Douglas's descriptions of the mother. McDowell refers mostly to Douglas's effacing of his maternal legacy and using black maternal figures in his narratives to advance his claims to rugged individualism and self-made genius. While this is true, there is also another implication of this latent grammar, and that is that Douglas consistently writes of black female abuse and sexualization in order to locate the unspeakable dimensions of his own sex and embodied knowledge within this latent framework. As scholars, we have tended to read Douglas's narratives at the levels of rhetorical performance, convention, and sign. If rhetoric is the cumulative effect of oration, then grammar parses the finer units and the even finer components of these that enable this effect. A grammatical reading of Douglas's life and work begs that we draw closer, paying greater attention to mechanics, to details of body proximity, nuance, subterfuge, and male and female modes of speaking. Taking the idea of grammar literally, we should know that it is from women, such as Sophia Hugh, that Douglas first gains the rudimentary structure of the language. She teaches him the letters of the alphabet, to spell words of 3 or 4 letters, and to pronounce words from the Bible. It is her husband, Mr. Hugh, who breaks in on this opportunity for Douglas and forbids his wife to continue instruction. Ironically, from Master Hugh's lecture forbidding his reading, Douglas receives his first decidedly anti-slavery lecture. Sophia's gesture toward teaching the rudiments of the language and her husband's negative response teach Douglas the first rules of the social grammar, inversion and subterfuge. He will apply these tools when he goes on to trick young boys into teaching him English by challenging their intellects, exchanging food for grammar lessons, and mimicking the letter system used to mark crates at the shipyard. Moreover, in the second narrative, My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglas reveals that his mother could read and attributes his love of reading and the creative means of acquiring literacy to her. I am happy to attribute, he says, any love of letters I possess, not to my admitted Anglo-Saxon paternity, but to the native genius of my sable, unprotected, and uncultivated mother. As with Hester, Captain Anthony sexually violated Douglas's mother, perhaps even subjected her to the same manner and style of abuse. The text of the page and the text of the female body are coterminous. For Douglas, learning to read and speak the written word would always intersect with speaking from, around, and through sexual abuse and sexual consumption, lending an entirely different interpretation to McDowell's notion of latent grammar informing Douglas's engagement with the black mother/woman. Male daughter. Scholars have had a challenging time deciphering Douglas's public letter written to his former slave master, Thomas Auld, in 1848. William S. McFeely, the Douglas biographer, refers to the letter as one of the strangest pieces in the literature of American slavery. What makes this letter so strange is the fact that Douglas speaks vicariously through the voice and body of a young white daughter. Added to this, he alludes to a relationship, a very intimate, erotic relationship, between himself and his former master in this female voice. One gets the sense of Douglas and his former master as estranged natural enemies on one hand and, on the other, as intimate sharers of a deep, binding secret. When one thinks about this letter written by Douglas as a coded way of speaking about his own rape, his own body through female metaphor, it does not appear strange at all. Instead, it serves as an example of how Douglas's overt grammatical gestures were oftentimes informed by latent, inverted references to his own sex and sexualized treatment. The occasion for writing the letter is the anniversary of Douglas's emancipation. Celebrating himself in his own venue, the North Star newspaper, Douglas gives his own synopsis of his liberation and what it means to him, 3 years removed from a life of bondage. Addressing Auld in 1848, he writes, "Sir, the long and intimate, though by no means friendly, relation which unhappily subsisted between you and myself, leads me to hope that you will easily account for the great liberty which I now take in addressing you in this open and public manner. I have selected this day on which to address you, because it is the anniversary of my emancipation. How, let me ask, would you look upon me, were I, some dark night, in company with a band of hardened villains, to enter the precincts of your elegant dwelling, and seize the person of your own lovely daughter, Amanda, and carry her off from your family, friends, and all the loved ones of her youth, make her my slave, compel her to work and take her wages? More and still more horrible, leave her unprotected, a degraded victim to the brutal lust of fiendish overseers who would pollute, blight, and blast her fair soul, rob her of all dignity, destroy her virtue, and annihilate in her person all the graces that adorn the character of virtuous womanhood. I ask, how would you regard me, if such were my conduct? What has struck many as immediately strange is Douglas's slipping between a speaking I and a speakerly her, essentially his easy transition between his black male body and voice and the voice and body of a young white plantation mistress. In particular, for McFeely, most strange is the fantasy of the rape of Amanda, the daughter of Thomas and Lucretia, whom Douglas remembered both as a child old cherished and as one who had been a kind of young friend. Others, reading against the grain of the letter, have hinted that Amanda is a metaphor for Douglas's own ravishing at the hands of white men. I agree with this perspective and feel that what Douglas attempts to convey through this letter are the powerful ways in which he and Ald share a union in body and soul, the fact that they share a terrible calamity that has made them both kin. Were Douglas, hypothetically speaking, Ald's daughter, such acts committed against him by Ald and other men of his class would qualify as acts of incest. Keeping the letter to Ald in mind and returning to the narrative, we find a direct correlation between the sacrifice of the daughter to the brutal lust of fiendish overseers and the rape of Douglas at the hands of the slave breaker Covey. A short time after being sent to Covey, Douglas is given the responsibility of herding the oxen. While standing at the gate to Covey's plantation, the oxen grow excited and rush through the gate, tearing their cart to pieces and almost crushing Douglas against the gate. A livid Covey discovers his demolished property. In his anger, he orders Douglas to strip down nude in preparation for a beating. He ordered me to take off my clothes. I made him no answer. He repeated his order. I still made him no answer, nor did I move to strip myself. Upon this he rushed at me with the fierceness of a tiger, tore off my clothes, and lashed me till he had worn out his switches, cutting me so savagely as to leave marks visible for a long time after. Douglas makes much of the pleasure and excitement that Covey receives from such seasoning rituals. The suggestive nudity, the tearing into flesh, the physical climaxing, and the wearing out of lash and clothing all suggest a type of sexual violation. In My Bondage and My Freedom, references to ravishment recur. In another instance, among many, Covey tears into Douglas even more viciously, causing Douglas to proclaim, "Had I escaped from a den of tigers, I could not have looked worse." After this beating, Douglas escapes from Covey with the intention of going to Ald, showing him the horrific proof of his condition, and seeking his intercession. I had begun to hope that my master would now show himself in a nobler light than I had before seen him. But I was disappointed. I had jumped from a sinking ship into the sea, I had fled from the tiger to something worse. In this passage, we have a direct correlation between the master who prostitutes his daughter to the brutal lust of fiendish overseers and Ald himself. Whereas Covey is true to his nature, bloodthirsty and predatory by virtue of his vocation and temperament, Ald is an altogether different animal. The letter makes clear that what makes Ald even more reprehensible, more immoral than Covey, is the fact that there is a blood tie, a clandestine kinship that binds him to Douglas. Covey's crime is rape, but Ald's is incest. He takes the ultimate pleasure and gain from Douglas's violation, the breaking of his slave, reinforcing his genteel Southern standing, his authority and affluence among plantation-owning peers. Covey makes delight and sport of Douglas. He tortures him at least once a week for 6 months. The reader has to but repeat, in his own mind, once a week, the scene in the woods, where Covey subjected me to his merciless lash, to have a true idea of my bitter experience there, during the first period of the breaking process through which Mr. Covey carried me. Following this passage, and in numerous places throughout Douglas's narrative, he insinuates that much worse than what he can describe occurred on Covey's plantation. I have no heart, he admits, to repeat each separate transaction. Such narration would fill a volume much larger than the present one. I aim only to give the reader a truthful impression of my slave life, without unnecessarily affecting him with harrowing details. Up to this point, I have suggested that sexual violation is metaphorically present in Douglas's narrative, but I think it important to consider that Douglas may have in fact been literally raped. For what could be more harrowing in description than the blood-soaked scenes that he describes? What details, missing from all 3 volumes of his autobiographies, could fill additional volumes? A genre of short story and novels about slaves that became popular at the end of the 18th century is implicitly referenced in Douglas's narratives. In this tradition of writing, Europeans and white Americans graphically depicted the rape of enslaved males through language and metaphors similar to those used in Douglas's narrative. Joseph Lavallee's Le Negro comme il a pu de blanc, The Negro, as there are few white men, is a perfect example of this tradition. Lavallee, a French Montesquieuan, published Le Negro in 1790. That same year other authors translated the text into English and serialized it in magazines in England and the United States. The protagonist of Lavallee's novel, Itinoko, is a West African man captured by French slavers off the Gold Coast of West Africa and taken into slavery. Lavallee's text was a highly sexualized treatment of the African and European colonial relation. Ship hands consistently remarked upon Itinoko's physicality and imagined themselves bedding the African. His nakedness and the size of his genitalia are noted. Itinoko engages in a romantic friendship with the ship captain's son. The ship captain intends to sell Itinoko into a position of sexual service, but before selling him, cannot restrain the desire to sample the slave himself. Itinoko describes Urban, the white slaver, as a ravisher, a perfidious ravisher who was struck by my comeliness. Urban feels compelled to violate what is most sacred among men. Itinoko describes his rape in animal-like metaphors, saying, I bore resemblance to a man, who, weary with struggling with a tiger, that threatened his life, would fall into a voluptuous sleep, between the clutches of the monster. John Sallant described Itinoko as a prototype for the black man who appeared between 1790 and 1820 in anti-slavery narratives, essays, and poems. Deserving benevolence but denied it by his white masters. This sentimentalized poor Negro, he clarifies, on American soil, became an eroticized friend, echoing the homoeroticism of classical martial virtue as well as gesturing toward 19th-century blackface and its interracial homoerotics. Douglas, as disenfranchised friend and one abolitionists ally with, definitely writes as a sentimentalized poor Negro. Furthermore, Itinoko's allusions to struggling with a tiger cast light on the sexual implications of similar details in Douglas's narrative. Even if Douglas did not read Lavallee's story, though it is possible that he did, either in American serialized form or during his time spent in England with Garrison, abolitionists read the story in serialized form in U.S. magazines. Douglas wrote to a community of readers on both sides of the Atlantic that would have implicitly understood his allusions to that most unspeakable outrage, male rape. Furthermore, it was common within the U.S. sentimental tradition to refer to rape through animal metaphors, such as tigers and wolves. In Red Rock, 1898, Thomas Nelson Page describes the rape of a white woman by a black man as a single tiger spring, as black claws sinking into a soft white throat. Abolitionists and the larger educated American readership would have immediately recognized Douglas's numerous references to rape and been able to read between the lines of the narrative to ascertain that Douglas had probably been raped by Covey or other males in the plantation community. Hazel Carby makes a useful point regarding how we think about rape on and off the plantation and at different moments in American history. Rape should not be regarded as a transhistorical mechanism of women's oppression but as one that acquires specific political or economic meanings at different moments in history. Carby refers here to the need to distinguish the political import of black women raped on plantations from black women raped during the Reconstruction era in the South as a means of economic and social control. Her statement, though, applies also to the subject of male rape. We have tended to regard rape as happening only to biological females. In black uplift discourse, the phallus and castration of the phallus are always emphasized. Yet what does it mean that Douglas, reticently in his first narrative and more directly in his second and third narratives and in his letter to Wald, calls our attention to the subject of male rape? I find that what we get, in part, through Douglas's depictions of rape is his understanding of rape as definitionally linked to a culture of consumption. From Hester being tempered and flesh tendered in the Anthony kitchen to perpetrators depicted as tigers and wolves, Douglas emphasizes how rape and sexual violence are a means of satiating a cultivated wide appetite for black flesh. Southern slavery apologist George Fitzhugh explained the political economy of slave consumption in the following manner: the use of an article is only a proper subject of charge when the article is consumed in the use, for this consumption is the consumption of the labor of the lender or hirer, and is the exchange of equal amounts of labor for each other. Thought of as an object of labor, as labor itself, in the mind of many slave owners, the slave could be completely consumed with no moral repercussions. Rape in this context serves as an index for a larger culture of consumption, the sex act being a means to take self from the slave and ritualistically consume this taken self. This subtext of sex and consumption lends an entirely different meaning to constant references to female rape in black male writings. Surely it tells us something about the nature and confines of black masculinity in the 19th century, specifically about the impossibility of translating black male sexual abuse into usable political currency. The raped black female/emasculated black male dyad aside, black men among themselves held each other to a strict code of masculinity that entailed never being sexual subjects and defining their masculine relationship to one another through black-female violation. Writing to the tribe of black husbands and fathers, in Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world, David Walker implored, "Oh, my colored brethren, all over the world, when shall we rise from this death-like apathy, and be men?" Walker implicitly defined black manhood as the ability to protect wives and mothers from rape and other forms of abuse. For men like Douglas and Walker, the subjects of female rape and the larger institution of slavery linked implicitly to the issue of social consumption. Walker never lived as a slave. He was born to a free mother and an enslaved father in Wilmington, North Carolina. Yet he understood slavery as fundamentally a system of appetite and consumption. In Walker's appeal, he writes, "They keep us miserable now, and call us their property, but some of them will have enough of us by and by, their stomachs shall run over with us, they want us for their slaves, and shall have us to their fill." For Walker, social consumption is equal to social death, a death like apathy. The outcome of black persons continually fed into the glut of slavery is that they will cease to exist, literally, psychologically, and spiritually. Already in their death-like apathy, Walker finds that black men have faded from their lives and from natural agency. Walker invokes the female body as womb and vessel of racial continuity, subtly connecting this aspect of black female anatomy to social consumption, viz. "We cannot help the whites murdering our mothers and our wives," he says. He ties racial continuity to the female anatomy. Black male rape, the particulars of black male consumption, and black male reproductive capacity do not figure into Walker's cosmos. In this worldview, the black woman symbolizes body and sex and the black male embodies the opposite values, reason, action, and virility. The black male does not have a reproductive capacity, and he also has no strongly defined interiority. Douglas writes within a similarly closed circuit, alluding to himself as erotically consumed but finally positioning himself outside this dynamic through his notorious battle with Covey, his acquired literacy, and his eventual escape from slavery. The letter written to Alden Douglas's descriptions of ravishment at the hands of Covey, though, disrupt this genealogy and urge us to rethink this idea of the feminine as external to black male experience. Might the allusions to himself as daughter and as sexually vulnerable be indicators of a regenerative capacity, an ability to regenerate self that elided the larger culture of sexual and psychic consumption? Along this same line, might Douglas have revealed, at the same time that he concealed, how his master related to him and saw him as a daughter or as a feminized sexual conquest? Whites were fond of referring to him as the only perfectly pronounced and complete specimen in the world of his color, kin and kind. As a youth, the race leader carried a newspaper clipping around that described him in romantic terms as a uniquely American creature, a natural outcome of the fated American experiment, Mount Caucasus, and, the mountains of the moon were joined with our Indian wilderness to mix the strain of blood from 3 races in his veins and produce a peculiar individuality with no antecedent or copy of his traits. Evoking at once savagery, the feminine allure of the natural world, and the danger of colonization, of occupying a foreign territory. This article served as a reminder that Douglas's masculinity was an open-ended question that could be just as easily deployed by the state and the abolitionist cause. This discussion picks up many of the themes of male rape that I earlier elucidated, the ways in which and reasons that black male rape has remained a categorical impossibility and therefore impossible to speak about. On political and rhetorical levels, the subject of black male rape has always implied much more than the sex act or sexual preference. Douglas's letter and, in his personal narrative, his abuse under Covey convey the subject of male rape has layered through with issues of black/white kinship, gender variance and ambiguity, and the conundrum of same-sex reproduction. Naturally, when we have thought about the rape of black women during slavery, we have thought in terms of progeny or reproductive capacity. Our limited concepts of black male biology and interiority have inhibited our thinking on the topics of black male emotional and erotic life and, more specifically, black men having the ability to generate life. A part of what I am urging and will reinforce in the next section of this chapter is that we expand our notions of black experience and cultural formation to include black men as agents of reproduction, sexual subjectivity, and effeminate values, among other categories of experience. Mapping mother hunger. In the final phase of this chapter, I want to dwell more fully upon the idea of the black male interior. The themes of emotional, psychic, and spiritual hunger have historically constituted female domains of experience. Within 19th-century rhetoric, men do not speak, at least overtly, in terms of hungering, needing to be filled emotionally or otherwise. It is like an undiscovered, mysterious land, this region of black male interiority that we suspect exists but that we have little concrete evidence of, few artifacts with which to verify its existence. In Douglas's writings, mother loss and mother hunger, the desire for the mother, the desire for an intimate familial touch, to know one's origins and tribal legacy, serve as emotional guideposts that help us to understand where and how Douglas hungered and from where within himself he transformed this potentially self-consuming hunger. In my final analysis, I read this mother hunger, beyond the physical loss of his mother, as a fecund place within Douglas's self from which he gives birth to the promise of the Republic, himself as masculine icon, and all of the emotional and psychic hungers that he carries out of slavery. Although he sees very little of her, Douglas's mother leaves an imprint on his emotions and memory that will later permeate and shape his masculine identity and internal landscape. In the narrative, he recalls that in spite of the risk of death and the threat of potential beatings, his mother frequently traveled miles to visit him at night. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot, after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise, unless a slave has special permission from his or her master to the contrary, a permission which they seldom get. As an infant, Douglas cannot be aware of the hardships and fatigue that his mother undergoes to be with him. The 4 or 5 times that he sees her he feels only her warm comfort. They communicated very little during these nightly rituals. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me, and get me to sleep, but long before I awake she was gone. And long before Douglas could awaken as an adult man to the great pains and obstacles his mother overcame to see him, she dies. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with it her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old, on one of my master's farms, near Lee's Mill. 69. Adding to the pain of this loss is the fact Douglas was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or burial. A pattern of loss and unrequited need is set in Douglas. Plantation culture and masters cultivated this emotional and natal hunger. Such hunger, arguably more than physical acts of torture, conditioned slave psyches and bodies for larger acts of social and literal consumption. In the narrative, Douglas describes how he, his sister Eliza, and his aunt Priscilla were kept in a state of perpetual hunger and starvation. A great many times have we poor creatures been nearly perishing with hunger, when food in abundance lay moldering in the safe and smokehouse, and our pious mistress was aware of the fact, and yet that mistress and her husband would kneel every morning, and pray that God would bless them in basket and in store. In addition to starving Henny, Ald would frequently tie her up and whip her as precourse to taking his meals. I have known him to tie her up early in the morning, and whip her before breakfast, leave her, go to a store, return at dinner, and whip her again, cutting her in the places already made raw with his cruel lash, recalls Douglas. What makes Henny so delectable to the master is the fact of her being almost helpless. Henny has no parents to protect and look out for her. Burnt during a childhood accident, she has little use of her hands. Her state of deprivation slakes Ald's appetite and causes him to choose her, above all others, as the object of his morning and evening meal-taking rituals. Later in life, Douglas would experience a no less cruel form of starvation conditioning at the behest of Mrs. Lucretia Auld, the female head of the plantation. Often Mrs. Auld forced Douglas to sing for his food beneath her bedroom window. When pretty severely pinched by hunger, I had a habit of singing, which the good lady very soon came to understand as a petition for a piece of bread. When I sung under Miss Lucretia's window, I was very apt to get well paid for my music. Making Douglas perform in the age-old role of the romantic singer, Mrs. Auld seemed to imagine him courting her or titillating her with his hungering pleas. She no doubt took pleasure in such remonstrations, which she encouraged and rewarded with food. Many on the plantation implicitly understood this culture of hunger and deprivation as it was acted out in daily relations. Aunt Katy, the cook on the Anthony plantation, would frequently punish Douglas for a slight or an offense by making him go all day without food. Douglas would often fight the dog for scraps of food and bake stolen pieces of dried corn in the fire. Such acts of starvation wounded Douglas most deeply in his heart and soul. He writes of trying to keep his spirits up but eventually going out behind the kitchen wall to cry. Surprising Aunt Katy one day, Douglas's mother visits and witnesses her starving him. His mother has words with Katy. That night, he says, I learned as I had never learned before, that I was not only a child, but somebody's child. I was grander upon my mother's knee than a king upon his throne. For Douglas, the worst starvation involved being emotionally cut off from and made to hunger for his mother's love and care. His mother literally and spiritually saves him from self-consumption, starvation, by affirming and feeding his sense of self. For that was the danger and underlying intention of the culture of consumption, to imprint slaves so deeply with hunger that they came to relate to themselves as essentially commodities and to also consume themselves with a litany of soul-devouring thought and behaviors reinforced by the master's hungers and tastes. Despite the oppressive intentions of masters who facilitated this culture of hunger, enslaved persons often found the will to invert this structure, using their own hunger as a means of resistance and survival. The graphic example of Lavinia Bell conveys a sense of hunger as the will to survive. As punishment for running away from the plantation, Bell's master leaves her to hang in a tree by wire threads that cut into her flesh. She suffers starvation and the devouring presence of birds and other animals of prey. After days left in this condition, Bell makes a strategic choice. She attempts to tear out her eyes and eat them. Douglas experienced such survivalist aspects of hunger as tied to the memory of and loss of his mother. Mother hunger informed his relationship with white male authority figures and heads of state. In the context of this hunger, white men took on maternal significances and roles in Douglas's life. This deep yearning for the feminine, in some instances, brought the same out of Douglas, who depicted himself and the heroic male figure as giving birth to the values and central tenets of the Republic. Operating out of an essentially feminine praxis of survival, Douglas turns a potentially devouring legacy of slavery and emotional state of loss and longing into a self that is gender ambiguous and imbued with a regenerative capacity. One of the last places one might expect to find residues of Douglas's mother loss and child need would be in his adult relationships to white men. From the mythic battle with Cavaillon, Douglas would have us believe that he approaches and quickly passes beyond the temporal and psychic territory of slavery. But even at the end of the narrative, as Douglas intently pores over issues of the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator and prepares himself to enter fully into the abolitionist speaking circuit, he admits, "I felt myself a slave, and the idea of speaking to white people weighed me down." 9 years later, white abolitionists would oppose Douglas's wish to start his own paper, referring to him as a slave, assuming to instruct the highly civilized people of the North. These contemporary eruptions of slavery differed from the personal, sacred ways that Douglas carried slavery in his heart and mind. In a letter written to Harriet Tubman in 1868, Douglas refers to her and John Brown as consigned to a sacred memory of slavery. The sacred memory of slavery arose from a tender place in Douglas connected to his mother. Remarking on the death of his mother and the fact that he was denied permission to attend her funeral in My Bondage and My Freedom, he stated that scenes of sacred tenderness, around the deathbed, never forgotten, and which often arrest the vicious and confirm the virtuous during life, must be looked for among the free, though they sometimes occur among the slaves. It has been a lifelong, standing grief to me, that I knew so little of my mother, and that I was so early separated from her. This sacred, maternal memory is connected to feelings of safety, the relieving of the slave child's suffering, and a longed-for home space. When he felt in this way toward white male allies, such as Garrison, John Brown, and President Abraham Lincoln, Douglas usually also romanticized these men, describing them as perfect examples of beauty. Douglas reenacts this need for home and safety in the life and times of Frederick Douglass. Approximately 10 years after Douglass has bested the brutal Covey, the race leader reaches yet another milestone in his quest for masculine identity. President Abraham Lincoln invites him to a party at the Executive Mansion in honor of his re-election. Douglas feels overwhelmed with the presence of the elite there and enthralled by the power of this historic moment. He writes, "I had for some time looked upon myself as a man, but now in this multitude of the elite of the land, I felt myself a man among men." Although under much different circumstances, this is another instance from Douglas's life when the presence of white men, of white male power and civilization, bring on an epiphany in the race leader. This newly discovered sense of manhood is only magnified by the presence of the white female friend, Mrs. Dorsey, who has agreed to accompany him on this journey. Hand in arm, the black Douglas and the white Mrs. Dorsey approach the entrance to the White House. At the entrance, Douglas's momentary reverie quickly shatters. The policemen stationed at the door to the president's mansion inform him that they are to admit no persons of his color and just as abruptly take him by his arm and order him to stand back. Suddenly, Douglas is outside. No longer a man among men, the officers, as policing extensions of the state, remind him of his nigger social status. No wonder the black men he invited refused his invitation. Used to such treatment from whites in low and high places, they did not look forward to such discomfiture, as they described it. Undaunted by the officer's racism, Douglas and his ally refused to leave. A passerby recognizes Douglas and rushes within to inform President Lincoln of his guest's detainment at the door. Lincoln immediately sends word to allow Douglas entrance to the mansion. Douglas and his companion are escorted into the spacious east room of the president's mansion. Douglas is taken aback by the luxuriousness of the scene, the bounty and plenty reflected in the architecture, the drink, the suited and gowned personages, the food, and the fraternity. He recalls a scene of such elegance such as in this country I had never witnessed before. Lincoln restores Douglas's masculinity and Douglas in turn responds with a description of Lincoln as rising like a mountain pine high above all the others gathered in that east room. Seeing Lincoln stirs deep feelings in Douglas. Lincoln counters his feelings of outsiderhood, of isolation with his grand simplicity, and home-like beauty. Lincoln's eyes and mouth move Douglas to poetic description. His eyes had in them the tenderness of motherhood, and his mouth and other features the highest perfection of a genuine manhood. Douglas's childhood dreams and maternal hunger are mapped onto the larger American dream and the White House as home. Longing after and eulogizing Lincoln's maternal bosom, Douglas asks, "What are sweet of peace, what are visions of the future?" Like his very own laboring mother, Douglas finds in Lincoln's face a blending of suffering with patience and fortitude. Douglas even romanticizes the president's lips, imagining them as perfect, aesthetically pleasing, and the most genuine specimens of manhood. A part of what made Lincoln so attractive to Douglas was the president's apparent commitment to freeing enslaved persons. Both Tubman and Brown of sacred memory sacrificed their lives for enslaved persons. It is something of the slave in Douglas, the one who has had to constantly battle for freedom and a place to rest, who sees finally in Lincoln the maternal bosom, an emblem of a final resting place. He relates to Lincoln as a romanticizing male child, a male-to-female romantic object. Lincoln is in turn depicted as male patriarch, as maternal figure, as fecund female earth. The undercurrent of mother hunger blurs gender boundaries and causes Douglas to transfer to Lincoln a measure of unrequited love and feelings of mother loss. Descriptions of Mrs. Lucretia Auld years earlier on the Auld plantation prefigure his descriptions of Lincoln. Mrs. Auld, he writes, had bestowed upon me such words and looks as taught me that she pitied me, if she did not love me. In a related instance aboard a steamer, Douglas encounters Edward Marshall, a California congressman. He describes Marshall in terms that are both deific and evoke the natural world. The catalyst for Douglas when describing Marshall in this manner is a racist incident aboard the steamer. The captain orders Douglas to be physically removed from the dining room. Marshall rebuffs the steward with eyes full of fire. Douglas sees lightning flash and imagines this saving individual as a deity of the sky with golden hair and fiery eyes whose voice resounded like a clap of summer thunder. In this instance, Douglas casts himself in the more effeminate role, describing Marshall as chivalrous, gallant, and possessed of generous and manly qualities. Not coincidentally, Marshall has just come from Kentucky, where he visited his black mammy. "I was nursed at the breasts of a colored mother," he admits. Both Lincoln and Marshall intervene on behalf of the freed slave. Their allegiance to abolitionism evokes in Douglas romantic feelings that range from the maternal caste to a glorification of the white male as the emblem of the natural world and the natural order of things. Marshall does not take on the sacred significance and emotional complement of the black mother. Instead, black mother as emblem of infantile hunger, the white man nursing at the black woman's breasts, is cause for shared affection between the two men. Douglas was in a phase of his life when he believed that proximity to black nobility and empathy could change whites. He would realize, though, after finding out about Lincoln's support of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, that Northern whites had used him and the enslaved person's cause to further their nationalist and other political aims. At the undraping of a bust carved in Lincoln's honor years later, Douglas would describe Lincoln not as a caring, valiant romantic object but as one who had betrayed his love and affections. Speaking before hundreds of white persons at this honorary occasion, Douglas regrettably reminds those gathered of Lincoln's hypocrisy and willingness to sacrifice black people. He says, "He was ready to execute all the supposed guarantees of the United States Constitution in favor of the slave system anywhere inside the slave states. He was willing to pursue, recapture, and send back the fugitive slave to his master, and to suppress a slave rising for liberty, though his guilty master were already in arms against the government." Lincoln's willingness to send a fugitive slave back to his master was most painful to Douglas, who was himself an escaped slave. In this public address, Douglas speaks about how he, as a representative of the slave experience, felt betrayed by one he was so willing to love, admire, and seek solace in. Speaking to his white fellow citizens, Douglas admonishes, "First, midst, and last, you and yours were the objects of his deepest affection and his most earnest solicitude. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity. To you it especially belongs to sound his praises, to preserve and perpetuate his memory, to multiply his statues." Douglas speaks of white people as children, Lincoln's true children, and of black people as stepchildren. This statement harkens back to the problematic issue of kinship between white and black men during slavery. Douglas is a free man, a man of agency and affluence, but still the historical problem of relatedness and all of its emotional and sexual implications bear down upon him in the present. It is during slavery that the orator first develops the habit of romanticizing and identifying himself with the white male aristocracy. When he leaves the Covey plantation, he contrasts Covey's membership in the demeaned overseer class to that of a Mr. Freeland. Freeland acts toward him with the sentiment of honor, a sense of justice, and a feeling of humanity. Mr. Freeland belongs to that class of slaveholder admired and affectionately thought of by the slaves. Slaves were not, Douglas notes, insensible to the whole-souled qualities of a generous, dashing slaveholder, who was fearless of consequences, and they preferred a master of this bold and daring kind, even with the risk of being shot down for impudence. Following this logic of aristocratic refinement, one can understand how Douglas found in Lincoln the perfect embodiment of the ennobled father figure. In reality, Lincoln's response to black people ranged from repulsion to exotic fascination. He enjoyed minstrel culture and had minstrel troupes come to the White House to entertain him, and also was known to attend shows when he visited Chicago. Most whites presumed that white blood gave the Negro higher intelligence, beauty, and more evolved sensibilities. The very high cultural standards that Douglas used to distinguish himself from the base Negro are the same standards that make him attractive to and ultimately dispensable to the president. By calling attention to their kinship bond, Douglas reveals how deeply intertwined issues of relatedness between black and white men with the subject of nation formation are for him. Lincoln fails, as the father-mother figure, to live up to Douglas's natal and maternal expectations. And he confirms in Douglas the permanence of his orphaned, homeless social status. As maternal caretaker and sustainer of the central tenets of the Republic, Douglas expects that Lincoln will give rebirth to the slave, not just freeing him in word from slavery but birthing him into a social and political body that cancels out the social death of slavery. By the time Douglas makes the speech before the Freedmen's Monument and begins years later to work on the life and times, he had seen Reconstruction efforts go drastically awry. The Freedmen's Savings Bank fiasco, the stealing of land promised to freed persons, and the erection of Jim Crow laws served as indicators of how the nation seemed intent on keeping the slave buried, freed from the coffin of slavery but socially dead in all other respects. Driven by the need for a collective rebirth of himself and the masses of black people, Douglas would ultimately locate this regenerative capacity in himself. Mother hunger, the sense of being orphaned from the nation, the desire for intimate belonging, and his own personal legacy of sexual violation, would fuel and defines Douglas's attempts at self and national rebirth. Beginning to realize an interconnection between the rebirth of the nation and personal rebirth, Douglas broke from white abolitionists. In opposition to predominant abolitionist views, Douglas became convinced that there was no necessity for dissolving the union between the northern and southern states. He felt that the vote was power and that the Constitution of the United States not only contained no guarantees in favor of slavery, but, on the contrary, it is, in its letter and spirit, an anti-slavery instrument, demanding the abolition of slavery as a condition of its own existence, as the supreme law of the land. Breaking from abolitionists and feeling more freed from his slave past did not mean that Douglas did not have to contend with white male desires, with white male appetites within a culture of consumption. If anything, Douglas understood better how the plantation was as a little nation of its own and how the nation operated in many respects like the plantation. Douglas came to a much fuller understanding of the plantation as an incestuous household/nation and the larger republic as a social grave and promise of stillborn birth. As I argued earlier in this chapter, throughout history black men have typically imagined this dynamic of birth and domesticity in their writings in oppressive female terms. Douglas does this in all of his autobiographies, through depictions of black women raped, especially his mother and his aunts. But what I want to draw our attention to is how this potentially fecund space was also depicted in his fiction and non-fiction writings as a male womb-type space, a regenerative space with capacity to give birth to self, nation, and a transformed citizenry. The idea was that if Douglas and black men like himself could give birth to the nation, then they could, on terms of their own, finally exist. It was a homosocial maternity that Douglas conceived that still largely excluded women and black female maternity on practical, feminist levels. Still, this gesture toward embodying his hunger for liberty and social acknowledgement points us to entirely new ways of thinking about racial legacy and black masculinity in the 19th century. The Heroic Slave, Douglas's only published fictional work, teems with references to black male fecundity. Published in 1852, this text, in title and storyline, continues what would be Douglas's lifelong project of elevating and glorifying the heroic black male figure. The hero of the story, Madison Washington, is a composite figure based partly on the leader of the revolt aboard the slave ship Creole and President George Washington. The story opens with the narrator having the reader peer into the dark, a dark pregnant with liberty and the legacy of Patrick Henry, who led all the armies of the American colonies through the Great War for freedom and independence. We are told that someone is enveloped in darkness and then taken into the searching dark, only to return from the pursuit like a wearied and disheartened mother, after a tedious and unsuccessful search for a lost child. This maternal darkness takes on human form a few pages into the story when from the darkness Washington steps with arms like polished iron, a face black, but comely, a brow as dark and as glossy as the raven's wing. At the beginning of the story, it is Washington who prays in the darkness, who draws into his speaking John Listwell, a northern white man who feels compelled to stop, descend from his horse, and listen. Listwell, whom we might also think of as Listens Well, we learn, had long desired to sound the mysterious depths of the thoughts and feelings of a slave. As his eye catches hold of Madison in the shadows, he trembles, with terror and excitement. Washington's prayer titillates Listwell, who receives his remonstrations as a type of erotic climax. He did not have to wait long. There came another gush from the same full fountain, now bitter, and now sweet. Afterward, Washington takes on a glow to his countenance and teems with a hope of freedom, that seemed to sweeten the bitter cup of slavery. The fact that Washington ruminates on his wife, Susan, in the darkness and experiences anguish at the thought of having to leave her to escape north further highlights the clandestine, erotic sharing that Listwell experiences. He experiences Washington, and through Washington, the passion the enslaved man feels for his wife. This copulating in the mysterious, impregnated dark results in a rebirth for Listwell. Washington leaves the pine forest and begins his trek north to freedom, but his white interloper is forever changed. From this hour I am an abolitionist, he swears to himself, I have seen enough and heard enough, and I shall go to my home in Ohio resolved to atone for my past indifference to this ill-starred race, by making such exertions as I shall be able to do, for the speedy emancipation of every slave in the land. For all of its representational problems, which I will attend to shortly, this scenario is a striking break from the historical tradition of representing the black female body as the dark, chaotic interior of black experience. It is a unique moment through which we can imagine and begin to think about a politics of black male interiority and hunger. Moving beyond images of white males ravishing his body in the past and controlling the terms of erotic engagement, Douglas scripts a homoerotic interchange that is mutually beneficial. According to P. Gabrielle Forman, at the time that Douglas pens his story, he is acutely aware that white men are the only reader citizens imbued with legal standing as witnesses. They are his only politically embodied readers, the only ones, that is, with a vote. So as a way of harnessing this political power, Douglas attempts to seduce white male readers. Seduction is the means to constructing a new genealogy of American nativity based in the copulation of the black and white male. The character of Washington combines several strands of American radicalism in one person. He is a reference to the black plantation insurrectionist and to the founding revolutionary fathers of America, specifically George Washington and Patrick Henry. Before the House of Burgesses in 1775, Henry stated in his Liberty or Death speech, 3 millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country that which we possess, are invincible by any force which our enemy can send against us. This mandate for national security and fortitude remained unfulfilled in Douglas's mind with the continuance of slavery. Referencing the Henry speech in the Life and Times, he writes, It was a great thing to achieve American independence when we numbered 3 millions, but it was a greater thing to save this country from dismemberment when it numbered 30 millions. Douglas imagines the heroic male slave as the receptacle of the unrealized national vision Henry espoused. Douglas unites in his womb the opposite and contradictory forces of white paternity and black maternal legacy. Henry in Washington represents something of Douglas's own whiteness, his lifelong problematic relationship to white male paternal figures. Taking their seminal visions into himself, while problematic, is for Douglas the only choice if he is to make peace and home of an America plagued by white male immorality. Choosing to be a receptacle acknowledges as well the political reality of black people effeminized and eroticized by whites. Douglas's choice does not ameliorate the stigma and challenges of assuming a feminine posture. Rather, it serves as an example of one black man crafting agency and negotiating complex, fluid notions of gender at the same time that he experiences himself as circumscribed by these ideas. There is a passage in My Bondage and My Freedom where Douglas refers to his mother as resembling an Egyptian pharaoh. He writes, "There is in Pritchard's Natural History of Man, the head of a figure, on page 157, the features of which so resemble those of my mother, that I often recur to it with something of the feeling which I suppose others experience when looking upon the pictures of dear departed ones." Some have questioned why Douglas chose to represent his mother with the image of a male pharaoh. This is an important question, considering that in the same volume there are images of Hindu women and Northern and Southern African types that would have been more appropriate and accurate examples of Douglas's mother. If we think, though, of the image as a meshing of Douglas's maternal legacy with the Reformation of the U.S. Empire, then it makes sense. Douglas recasts his mother as the ancestral figure and bridge to an ancient African royal lineage. By depicting his mother as Ramses II, not only does he ennoble her, he also establishes, by virtue of his bloodline, his natural right of claim to the American legacy. This image of a male mother presented in the second and third installments of his autobiography reinforces how emotional natal needs confounded prevailing nationalist gender politics. Douglas's consistent move to externalize his natal hunger is instructive. It seems that implicitly he understood that in order to not be consumed by feelings of loss and the sense of emotional and spiritual dislocation that threatened him from without, he would have to actualize his emotional needs, his hungers. In the image of the male mother and his depictions of the fecund heroic male, we are shown how hunger facilitates a deeper grounding in geography and place and enables him to locate himself in history and in the context of national reformation. The heroic figure embodies Douglas's idea of the Constitution as an essentially anti-slavery document. He conveys his ideas of suffrage for black men through this heroic male who is male and female, a combination of women's suffragist politics and male slave abolitionist strivings. His hunger is male and female, or perhaps better understood as a cauldron of self and experience that syncretize the two. Hunger is power, or at least the means to accessing power encased within a discourse of nation. David Leverance has noted that Douglas's entrepreneurial notion of manhood meant not freedom so much as dominance and the fear of humiliation. As I have argued throughout this chapter, there was no humiliation deeper or more unspeakable than the sexual humiliation suffered by one man at the hands of another. Black men found the feminizing outcomes of such abuse untenable, as they translated neither into the preferred dominance over nor access to the entrepreneurial benefits of American capitalism. Yet the idea of Douglas as fecund in the image of the male mother suggests that things were not quite so simple. The image of the male mother is a syncretic figure that adds up, ultimately, to more than the sum of its parts. For example, while the male mother is a new emblem of the nation, it is also a deeply personal metaphor for Douglas, who himself/herself gives birth to this symbol of the new. The male mother is a coded representation of the ways that male-male relations for Douglas took form from a fluid sense of gender and the consistent goal of whites to make the male slave into an effeminate relational object. From the framework of the male mother, we see that Douglas was aware of and acted from a place of gender indeterminacy or fluidity. If we acknowledge this complex facet of his self-awareness and representational politics, then we must also acknowledge a broader understanding of who Douglas was and what he means to us in the present. In the 1960s and 70s, historians and activists sought to recover Douglas from the dark 19th century past as the tradition's very own representative man. At the end of the 20th century, cultural critics and feminist scholars such as McDowell, Charles Clifton, and Foreman began to unpack Douglas's heroic masculinity and suggested a more complicated genealogy or genealogies of Douglas's masculinity and personal legacy. I am advocating that our newer scholarship on Douglas integrate and apply the complex vision we now have of his person and contribution. We should see him simultaneously as a heroic male, a male daughter, a fecund, birth-giving male, a male child who was raped, a striving and self-serving patriarch, and an ennobled father of black letters and liberation. If I had to choose a more central motivation fueling these multiple, overlapping, and intersecting identities, I would choose hunger over and beyond reason, falling back upon the female genealogy of hunger and consumption evinced in Douglas's maternal relations and in his own embodied feminine sensibilities. Hunger, as I am thinking of it, is logical, reasoning, and strategic. It is also embodied, sensate, and intuitive. Hunger is a mediating, alchemical ground, a point from which Douglas consistently translated what was felt and desired into reason action, rhetorical performance, and civic belonging, as problematic as this always was. It is out of Douglas's hunger and in response to forces that threatened to consume him that he dreamed, envisioned, and embodied a nation as complex, unresolved, and revisionary as himself.